August 1944. High above the Baltic Sea, where the water below looks like polished steel and the horizon feels unnervingly close, a single RAF de Havilland Mosquito races east at just over 400 miles per hour. It is unarmed. It flies alone. There will be no escort, no formation, no covering fire. If something goes wrong, there is no one to help. Inside the cockpit, Flight Lieutenant James Archibald Byrne keeps his hands light on the controls. At 32,000 feet, the air is thin and unforgiving, each breath delivered through an oxygen mask that hisses softly with every inhale. Frost rims the canopy. The Merlin engines hum with a steady, almost comforting rhythm. Then the navigator speaks. Contrails. 2. East-southeast. Climbing fast. Byrne glances left. He sees them immediately, thin white scars being stitched upward through the flawless blue sky. The geometry is unmistakable. Soviet interceptors. Yak-9s, most likely. Their climb profile tells him everything he needs to know. 90 seconds. Perhaps less. The Mosquito is fast, faster than most fighters at this altitude, but speed alone is no longer the shield it once was. The navigator, Sergeant Peter Hollis, calls bearings and estimates closure rate, his voice controlled, professional. He offers no suggestion because there is none. There is no textbook answer to this problem. Byrne pushes the throttles forward anyway. The aircraft surges, the airframe vibrating faintly as speed climbs, for 10, for 20, but the contrails keep rising. The interceptors are being guided, not guessing. Ground radar has already solved the problem for them. Years later, intelligence officers and radar engineers will debate what happens next. Some will call it luck. Others will say it was desperation. A few will quietly admit it was something else entirely, an act of deliberate, calculated defiance against the rules of flight and doctrine. Byrne does not think in those terms. He simply acts. Without warning, he drives the left rudder pedal hard to the floor while keeping the control column nearly neutral. The Mosquito does not turn. It skids. The nose yaws violently left while the aircraft continues on roughly the same track, the fuselage slewing sideways through the air as if dragged by an invisible hand. Drag explodes. Airspeed decays. The cockpit shudders with uneven airflow. Hollis instinctively braces himself, certain they have been hit. They have not. For 8 long seconds, Byrne holds the skid. Then he releases the rudder, recenters the aircraft, and eases into a shallow dive. The Mosquito accelerates again, smooth and obedient, as if nothing unusual has happened. Behind them, the contrails sweep past to the north, overshooting by nearly a mile. The interceptors never correct. They continue along the path radar told them was right, hunting a target that no longer behaves like an airplane is supposed to behave. Byrne levels out at 28,000 feet and sets course southwest. Fuel is acceptable. Engines are healthy. His pulse barely changes. Hollis stares through the canopy, silent, replaying the last 30 seconds in his head. After a long pause, he finally asks, "How did you know that would work?" Byrne does not answer immediately. The summer of 1944 is a paradox in the European air war. Allied bombers dominate the daylight skies. Fighters rule the corridors between targets and bases. But above it all, higher than most fighters can climb and farther than escorts can reach, a different war is being fought by photo-reconnaissance pilots. It is a war without guns. Reconnaissance crews fly alone, unarmed, relying entirely on speed, altitude, and geometry to survive. Every mission is a calculation measured in fuel, oxygen, and exposure time. There are no warning shots. No second passes. One mistake means capture or death. The Mosquito is the perfect instrument for this work. Built largely of wood, balsa, spruce, and plywood, it is light, fast, and capable of climbing higher than almost anything the enemy can field. Twin Rolls-Royce Merlin engines give it the speed of a fighter and the range of a bomber. Its cameras photograph airfields, rail junctions, missile sites, and troop concentrations. Every sortie feeds the immense machinery of invasion planning and strategic bombing. But speed and altitude are no longer enough. By mid-1944, radar has changed the nature of pursuit. Ground stations can now see aircraft at ranges exceeding 50 miles. Controllers guide fighters precisely, removing the guesswork that once protected lone intruders. The hunter no longer needs eyes, only instructions. The Baltic region is especially dangerous. Reconnaissance flights over Riga, Tallinn, and Königsberg skirt both German and Soviet airspace. Politically, the situation is delicate. Operationally, it is lethal. Soviet air defense units have standing orders to destroy unidentified aircraft on sight. Allied markings do not matter. Apologies come later, if at all. The missions continue anyway, because the intelligence cannot be obtained any other way. Byrne flies from RAF Benson, west of Oxford. He is 26 years old. Before the war, he worked as a surveyor, calculating gradients and load tolerances for railway bridges. The work taught him patience, spatial reasoning, and respect for angles, lessons that translate easily to the cockpit. His logbook shows over 200 operational hours. He is quiet, methodical, unremarkable in appearance. His ground crew appreciates this. Loud pilots rarely live long. On the morning of August 14th, Byrne is briefed for a deep reconnaissance run over the Gulf of Finland. The target is a suspected forward airfield near Narva. The route threads a narrow gap between German flak positions on island chains and Soviet radar coverage on the mainland. Weather is clear. Visibility unlimited, which means visibility cuts both ways. Byrne takes off at 0600. The Mosquito climbs steeply, then settles into cruise. At altitude, the cold is brutal. Frost feathers along the canopy edges. Below, the Baltic is a flat, merciless mirror. The first pass over the target is perfect. Cameras roll. Byrne banks gently, already thinking about fuel margins and wind drift. Then Hollis spots the contrails. The interceptors are climbing before committing, a classic radar-guided tactic. Once they level off, they will have a narrow but lethal window where speed, altitude, and gun range intersect. Running straight will not work. Turning wastes speed. Diving burns fuel and risks flak. Byrne has seconds to choose. What he does instead is something he has thought about before, something he once felt but never tested in anger. And in that moment, with no doctrine to guide him and no margin left to lose, he decides that confusing the air might be better than outrunning it. Byrne did not arrive at the Baltic maneuver by accident. The idea had been forming for weeks, quietly, without notes or diagrams, just the persistent irritation of a man who knew a system well enough to sense when its rules were incomplete. By the summer of 1944, the reconnaissance war had entered a new phase, and Byrne understood the problem before most commanders did. The problem was radar. Early in the war, speed and altitude had been enough. Fly higher than fighters could climb. Fly faster than they could chase. If you were lucky, they never even saw you. If you were unlucky, they saw you too late. Radar erased that luck. Ground-based stations now detected aircraft far beyond visual range. Controllers plotted vectors, calculated closure rates, and fed interceptors a continuous stream of corrections. The sky had learned to see, and it did not blink. Losses among photo-reconnaissance crews began to creep upward. Not catastrophically, but steadily. Enough to appear in monthly summaries. Enough to worry people who understood statistics. Doctrine responded slowly, as doctrine always does. Pilots were told to vary routes, alter altitudes, avoid patterns. Use weather where possible. Fly higher. Fly faster. The instructions were sensible and incomplete. They reduced risk, but they did not solve the underlying equation. Radar still saw you. Byrne read the intelligence digests. He attended the briefings. He absorbed the conclusions and found them unsatisfying. They treated radar as an immovable force, something to work around rather than something to challenge. He suspected otherwise. The first hint came during a routine test flight 6 weeks before the Baltic mission. Byrne was flying low over Oxfordshire, evaluating a new camera installation. The air was turbulent, crosswinds strong enough to demand constant rudder input. At one point, distracted by instruments, he overcorrected. The Mosquito yelled sharply. Instead of immediately correcting, Byrne held the rudder input for a moment, curious. The aircraft slid sideways through the air, nose pointed well off the direction of travel. The sensation was deeply uncomfortable, not violent, but wrong. The Mosquito felt bloated, as though it occupied more space than it should, dragging unseen resistance through the sky. He corrected, stabilized, and finished the flight. But the sensation stayed with him. He mentioned it casually to his crew chief, Arthur Greaves, a man who trusted engines more than theories. Greaves asked if anything had broken. Byrne said no. The conversation ended there. Byrne kept thinking. A week later, he requested permission to conduct additional handling tests at altitude. The squadron commander approved, assuming Byrne was troubleshooting a control issue. Byrne climbed to 20,000 feet and began a series of deliberate rudder skids, sustained yaw inputs with minimal bank. Each time, the behavior was the same. Drag increased sharply. Airspeed decayed. Controls became heavy. But the aircraft remained stable, predictable, recoverable. The Mosquito did not depart controlled flight. It merely flew uncleanly. Byrne began to realize that uncoordinated flight was not chaos. It was simply another regime of flight, one pilots were trained to avoid, but not one the aircraft itself rejected. The connection to radar came later. During a mess conversation, Byrne found himself seated beside a signals officer recently transferred from radar research. The man mentioned, almost as an aside, that radar returns were strongest when a target presented a stable, predictable profile. Smooth flight, constant aspect, clean geometry. Byrne asked what disrupted that clarity. Turbulence, the officer said. Abrupt maneuvering. Anything that breaks the symmetry of the return. Byrne asked about sustained yaw. The officer frowned, said it might degrade returns, but added that no sane pilot would deliberately fly out of trim in combat. The speed loss alone made it suicidal. The risk outweighed the benefit. Byrne did not argue. He submitted a brief technical note to squadron intelligence, 2 pages, neatly written, outlining the concept of uncoordinated yaw affecting radar tracking. The note was acknowledged and quietly filed. Reconnaissance pilots were expected to fly missions, not speculate about electromagnetic theory. Byrne let it go. But he did not forget. On August 14th, when the Yak-9s began their climb, Byrne recognized the moment instantly. He had perhaps 90 seconds before interception geometry became lethal. Running straight would fail. Turning would fail. Diving would trade one danger for another. So he chose the option that did not exist in manuals. He built speed first, pushing the Mosquito close to its structural limits. Then, at the exact moment when ground control would be feeding final corrections to the interceptors, he drove the rudder pedal hard over. The skid was violent. The nose yawed nearly 30 degrees. The fuselage presented its full side to the airstream. Drag multiplied. Speed bled away. The controls fought him, airframe shuddering under asymmetric load. Hollis thought they had been hit. But on the ground, radar operators saw something else. The Mosquito's return weakened. Broke. Flickered. The clean blip fractured into noise. The tracking solution dissolved. For several seconds, long seconds, the aircraft existed only as uncertainty. The interceptors, reliant on continuous vectors, committed to a path that no longer matched reality. When Byrne recovered and dove away, the geometry was already broken. Back at RAF Benson, Byrne's debrief was factual and unemotional. He described the rudder input, the skid, the overshoot. He did not claim certainty, only probability. Visibility, he noted, had been unlimited. Contrails were visible for miles. The interceptors had not lost sight of him. They had lost the information that told them where to look. 2 days later, Byrne was summoned again, this time to meet his squadron commander and a visiting officer from the Air Fighting Development Unit, Wing Commander Trent. Trent had read the debrief carefully. He asked precise questions. Could the maneuver be repeated? Could it be controlled? Could it be taught? Byrne answered honestly. Yes, yes, and yes, with training. The skid was uncomfortable. It violated instinct. It demanded precise rudder control and acceptance of temporary vulnerability. Trent listened. Then he asked for proof. A controlled demonstration. Radar tracking. Measurement. Byrne agreed without hesitation. The test was scheduled for August 22nd at RAF Defford, home to Britain's radar research establishment. If Byrne was right, the sky itself would testify. The maneuver was tested under controlled conditions 10 days later at RAF Defford. Radar operators tracked Byrne's Mosquito as it flew straight and level at 30,000 feet. When he applied full rudder and held the skid, the radar return weakened sharply. In several sweeps, it vanished entirely. When he recovered and resumed coordinated flight, the signal reappeared. The effect lasted only seconds, but in interception geometry, seconds were decisive. Further trials confirmed the result. A sustained uncoordinated yaw disrupted both radar lock and Doppler tracking. Interceptors relying on ground control lost precise vectors long enough for the Mosquito to change heading, dive, or escape. The maneuver was officially designated uncoordinated yaw evasion and quietly incorporated into reconnaissance training as a last resort tactic. Between September 1944 and the end of the war, multiple Mosquito crews credited the skid with successful evasions, including at least one encounter with a German Me-262. The technique did not make aircraft invisible. It simply broke predictability, and predictability was what radar depended on. Byrne never sought credit. The maneuver appeared in training notes without attribution. It spread by word of mouth among pilots who flew alone, unarmed, and far beyond fighter cover. For a brief window in the war, it worked. James Byrne survived the conflict and returned to civilian life. Years later, his handwritten note proposing the idea was found in RAF archives and signed, unremarked, but correct. The tactic eventually became obsolete as radar evolved, but its lesson endured. Innovation did not come from headquarters. It came from a pilot who understood geometry, trusted physics, and chose an unorthodox answer when the standard ones led only to loss. For a moment in the summer of 1944, that was enough.